If you get nothing else out of this webinar, I hope that you take this away, that worship in a digital context requires translation. In fact, researchers often use the phrase digital culture as a way of describing how technology and the internet are reshaping the ways we interact together. Digital culture brings with it a unique way of behaving, unique ways of thinking, communicating, creating, and much more. But here's the good news. There's actually a long history within Christianity of worship taking root in new cultures and becoming creative and innovative forms of Christian practice. In fact, along with Teresa Berger, I want to suggest that the most important questions that digital worship raises are basic questions that transcend worship in any cultural context. That is, that they are questions about participation and presence, questions we need to be asking about our digital worship and our in-person worship. My friend Johnny Baker has this wonderful line about the purpose of Christian worship. He says that worship imagines a world. Now, notice he doesn't say that worship ought to imagine a world. He says it already does. And so the question then becomes, what kind of world does your worship imagine? Now, that probably sounds like a very abstract question, but really, I think it's a design question. Asking yourself, what kind of world does our worship imagine? It can be a helpful way of asking difficult, evaluative questions about your worship. How does the worship we plan imagine relationships between pastors and participants? Who gets to speak and who doesn't? Do the images that we use depict the fullness of humanity as God created it to be? Or do they just reflect us in our little group? Does our worship planning center on the style of worship we like? Or does it try to discern where God is calling us to take more risks, to go out into the margins, or otherwise disrupt those things we hold dear? And once you've explored some of those questions, here's two more that you might consider. What does it look like to fully participate in worship? And what does it look like to be fully present for worship? Participation and presence. These are two of the most important invitations of our communal worship, to be present to ourselves, to each other, and to God, and to participate actively in a community at worship. Now, it's helpful to sit back and ask these big picture questions because then you can translate them into your digital context. If you're not clear about your own answers to these questions, it's going to be hard to take full advantage of the digital context. Now, for the purposes of this webinar, let's talk about the two basic platforms for digital worship because each of them have their own kind of logic. The two that we see most commonly are broadcasting and video conferencing. Broadcasting, of course, would include either pre-recorded broadcasts that are then released at a certain time, or live stream. That's also a form of broadcasting. And video conferencing, of course, is Zoom, Google Meetings, Skype, and all the rest. Now, keep these big picture questions on the left side of your screen in the front of your mind, because I want to share some of the limits and possibilities that we've seen in each of these platforms. So broadcasting and video conferencing. Each of these, of course, have their own possibilities and limits. Neither of these two are inherently better than the other. In our congregational research, we've seen very good examples of broadcasting, both pre-recorded and live stream. And we've seen not so good examples. And likewise, we've seen really good examples of Zoom worship, and we've seen a lot of not so good examples. Now, in a few minutes, I'll share a couple of case studies, one from each of these two platforms. But first, let's take a little bit to just name some of those possibilities and limits. I'm going to just adjust my screen on my end. Give me a second. So some of the possibilities of broadcasting include some things like this. With broadcasting, many congregations have found that they're able to build and use their existing infrastructure, whether that be cameras because they're already live streaming, or just their audio system that they already have in their worship facility. There's also a really great possibility in broadcasting as a modality because you can get a very high production value. That means more control over things like the quality of your video and your audio, and ability to capture different kinds of movement that might be happening in your worship setting. And through broadcasting, you can achieve a media-rich worship experience that's very engaging. In fact, sometimes it's a little counterintuitive, but sometimes that high production value uh, broadcasting worship is even easier to participate in because it's more similar to what we're used to seeing on Netflix and in our TVs and in the movies. It's a little bit closer to that. And so we're really quite familiar, quite fluent with participating in that. Video conferencing, though, has its own possibilities, of course. One of the best ones is that it requires little to no infrastructure. I'm sure many of you have already experienced that. It's highly interactive in that there's an equal opportunity to be seen and heard. And one of my favorite things about it is that it actually blurs the distinction between ritual and our everyday lives. What I mean by that is because everybody's video can be on, at least, sometimes they don't actually turn those videos on. But when those videos are all on, you have that wonderful tile background. You get to see the very stuff of our everyday lives, little windows into the everyday lives where we're trying to live out our faith as disciples of Jesus Christ. Also, in today's world, video conferencing like Zoom has become so ubiquitous that using it for worship is almost a way of sort of blessing that everyday curse that many of us experience. Many of us are on too many Zoom calls, but it's a way of transforming that ubiquitous part of everyday life into a ritual moment, into a sacred space. So I think that has a lot of possibilities. And I think we've seen some congregations in our research really take advantage of that, take their worship to all kinds of places, to street corners and local businesses, all of that through the video conferencing platform. It's produced some very creative possibilities. But of course, there's significant limitations to each as well. For broadcasting, it is true, I think, that often to do it well requires a significant investment in technology and staffing. And participation and presence can be limited to the chat or perhaps even to just pre-recorded contributions. And those have real limitations. Video conferencing, though, is also quite limited in other ways. I think it can be quite difficult to make Zoom actually feel like worship. And one of the things I think many, many congregations struggle with is how to do music well on Zoom. There, you're pretty much only limited to those pre-recordings. There's a couple of other things you might do to have better quality music on Zoom, but it can be very limiting to music. And for many of us, music is such an important part of that worship experience. So in short, broadcasting is best for capturing musical performances, staged actions, and video conferencing is best for facilitating structured conversations. Now, neither of those may be perfect fits for your congregation's in-person worship, but that's why digital worship requires translation.